I'm excited about a new online course that I've produced called The Unknown Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now you say, wait a second, those aren't the unknown Gospels. We know about those. They're the ones in the New Testament. Yes, indeed. I've given this course an ironic title, calling it The Unknown Gospels, because in my experience, even though almost everybody knows that these Gospels exist, most people don't know very much about them, and hence the title. I've got two reasons for thinking that most people don't know much about these Gospels, two anecdotal reasons. The first has to do with my teaching career. I've been teaching the New Testament for over 30 years now, and every semester every spring semester I give an introductory class, Intro to New Testament, large lecture class, 250, 300 students in it. Most of these students, most are from Christian homes. Most have been raised in the church, gone to Sunday school. They consider themselves Christians, or they start out Christians, and maybe questioning it in college or not questioning it. Maybe they're committed Christians. A range of students. And here at Chapel Hill, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, this is a good school. I get a lot of good students with interesting lives. And most of them think that since they've had this kind of background in their lives, they know a lot about the Bible. I mean, how hard is a course on the New Testament going to be? We're not talking quantum physics here. And that's absolutely right. We are not talking quantum physics. But as it turns out, almost everything we cover in this course is completely news for these students. To introduce them to that, the first day of class, before I even teach them anything, I give them a pop quiz. I talk about this quiz in this course, this online course. I talk about my quiz a little bit. There are 11 questions on this quiz, and in the past, what I've done is I've told my class, 250, 300 students, I tell them, if any of you gets 8 of these 11 questions right, I'll buy you dinner at the Armadillo Grill. So most years I have to buy maybe 2 or 3 dinners, and this quiz is not difficult. This is not even about scholarship. It's just about basic information about the Gospels, as I'll mention in the course. So my experience, at least with these 19 and 20-year-olds, is that they know about they know about the Gospels. They don't really have much information about them. My second anecdote is about myself. When I was young, I also was a church person. I grew up in the church and I went to Sunday school. And when I was in high school, I became an evangelical Christian and became really committed to understanding the Bible. I went to a conservative Bible college for my beginning of my college career. And so I studied the Gospels intently. I read them a lot. I got to a point where I had a pretty good idea what was in the Gospels. Even though I didn't know really the difference between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, at least I knew the basic stories fairly well. But later I realized, in fact, I did not know much about the Gospels at all, about them. I knew a lot of what was in them, but I didn't know much about them. And one of the points of this course is going to be that if you don't know about the Gospels, you're not going to understand them. There's a lot of information that really is helpful. And so in this course, we're going to be talking about a lot of this important background information as scholars have uncovered it during the past 300 years of scholarship. These scholars who've uncovered this material, there's broad unanimity on a number of really important points that most lay people don't really know about. And a lot of people who do know this kind of information or know basically a good bit about it, so some of you will be like that. You know a good bit of this information. Most people don't know why scholars say what they do about the Gospels. This course is going to cover both. It's going to both be what scholars have said about the Gospels, background information, and why they say it. When I was a young Christian reading the Gospels, I really didn't know much. I just assumed that everybody agreed that these books really were written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that they were written by Jesus disciples, close followers who were eyewitnesses, and they're recording what they saw him say and do. They wrote these things pretty soon after he died, that they were basically consistent with each other. They agreed with each other, that when there were differences, of course there are differences because you've got four of them and you've got four personalities producing these books, but even though there are differences, nothing was particularly significant. And I had all sorts of assumptions about these books that I now think are problematic assumptions. And in this course, I'm going to be trying to show why they're problematic. Not in a way that I'm going to insist that everybody agrees with me, but I think when you look at the evidence, you start realizing, yes, in fact, it is fairly problematic. When I was studying these books in Bible college, of course, I did know that there were Bible scholars who said that there are contradictions or that they weren't written by the apostles, but I really had no idea about how far back this kind of scholarship goes. For example, I just simply assumed that maybe like sometime in the early 20th centuries when scholars started realizing their problems with the Gospels or started arguing their problems in the Gospels, I didn't realize that these problems were recognized. Many of these problems were recognized in the ancient world. In the second and third centuries, there were Christian scholars who realized, whoa, there seems to be a contradiction here between Matthew and John. And early Christian scholars had to deal with this to explain these contradictions. Well, in this course, I'm going to be talking about a little bit about what ancient scholars said about these books and how they try to deal with some of these problems. Most of biblical scholarship, of course, originated in the fairly modern period, but most people have no idea about the significance, for example, of Martin Luther. Luther, the one who started the Protestant Reformation, developed views of Scripture that ended up being quite significant for why historical understandings of the Gospels developed later. Most people really don't know much about that at all, about the influence of Luther, or about the very beginnings of biblical scholarship, where during the Enlightenment, scholars really started recognizing, whoa, there are serious problems here. So this entire course is not going to be a dry history of scholarship. I'm going to be talking about the really interesting points in this history to show why it is scholars started thinking what they thought. And one of the first things that scholars noticed way back in antiquity, but especially during the Enlightenment, were some of the contradictions. In this course, I'll be talking about contradictions in the Gospels, or what strike me and most historical scholars as contradictions, and you can, of course, decide for yourself. I'll also be talking about the difference between a difference and a contradiction. Not every difference is contradictory. Differences are just because people tell different things. Contradictions, those create problems. I'll talk about why contradictions are a problem, both for understanding what Jesus said and did, and for understanding each of these Gospels. And one of the points I'm going to be making that most people really have never heard or even thought about, a point that I'll be emphasizing throughout this whole course, is that the contradictions among the Gospels and the stark differences among the Gospels do not degrade the Gospels or devalue them or denigrate them. If you recognize these historical findings by modern scholarship, it opens up entirely new vistas of understanding of these books. I'll be arguing that you simply can't understand Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John if you try to imagine they're all saying the same thing. They're not saying the same thing. And it's by seeing the contradictions that you realize that. And once you realize that, you start understanding each gospel for what its message is. And I'll be showing why these messages are all different from each other. I'll be talking a bit about why they probably were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'll be talking about why scholars date them when they do. Most historical scholars are agreed that our earliest gospel was the Gospel of Mark, and that it was written 40 years after Jesus' death, not by one of his disciples, by somebody living in a different country who never knew Jesus or never knew the disciples, who was writing a different language, was living in a different context and at a different time, and that affects how he tells his stories. It's also significant that two of our other Gospels, Matthew and Luke, appear to have used Mark's Gospel to make their own Gospels, and they changed it in places. sometimes significantly. Why would they do that? We'll be looking at the written sources of John as well and trying to see how the fact that different authors knew the writings of other authors and yet changed how that affects our interpretation of these books. But also, since these books are written 40, 50, 60 years after Jesus' life, that means a lot of these stories were in circulation by word of mouth. People are telling stories to each other about Jesus year after year, decade after decade. How does that affect the stories? When I was young, we had always heard that in oral cultures, people preserve their traditions accurately. If you don't have any written records to check, then you make sure you don't change the stories, because if you change the stories, you don't have, so you don't change the stories. That was what we always learned, is that in oral cultures, they have a way of preserving traditions intact. We'll be examining that assumption and be looking to see whether there's any evidence for it and whether there's any counter evidence for it. I'll be arguing that, in fact, in oral cultures, there simply isn't even the concern that we have in literary cultures to make sure that traditions don't change. That might be a concern we have, but it's not a concern that people in oral cultures tend to have. And how does that affect our understanding of the Gospels? I'll also be dealing with what happens after the Gospel writers wrote their books, because we don't have the original copies of any of these books. We don't have Mark's original thing. Many of you will know about this already, but our copies of the Gospels, most of them are from hundreds and hundreds of years later, and our copies all have differences among them. Lots of differences. I'll be arguing that most of the differences don't matter, but some matter a lot. I'll be picking out some examples that you may not know about of differences between manuscripts of Matthew. You have copies of Matthew. One has this words of verse this way, one words of this way. Luke, this passage is in some manuscripts, it's not in other. And I'll be showing not only that you have these big differences in places, but also these affect how a passage is understood, and sometimes how an entire book is to be understood, depending on which manuscript is right. And the kicker is, scholars can't agree on a number of these really big passages. Well, if you can't agree, even scholars who are dedicated to studying these can't agree, how does that affect our understanding of these books? Finally, in my last lecture, I'll be talking about why we have these four Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But today, I think a lot of people at least know that there were other Gospels written. We have Gospels allegedly written by Thomas and by Jesus' brother James and by Philip. We have a Gospel of Mary Magdalene. We have a Gospel of Judas. Why weren't these included in the New Testament? Who decided? When? And on what grounds? So that will be the final lecture, why we have these four Gospels. So these are many of the issues I'll be dealing with, and with others, in this 8-lecture course. What scholars say about the Gospels and what evidence they have. I consider this to be vital information. If you really want to understand the Gospels, even whether it's for reasons of faith, or because you're historically interested, or you're just curious, or you know that these books are foundational for Western culture for whatever reason, well, I hope you can check out the course. You'll find it at bartehrman.com/Gospels. bartehrman.com/Gospels. As you'll see, there are 8 lectures. The lectures are about 30 minutes in length each. But when you buy the course, you're not only getting the 8 lectures, you also will be getting some written materials. I've provided summaries so that you can see in a nutshell what each of the 8 lectures is about, what my arguments are, just in a brief summary. I also include questions for thought for each lecture. These are not questions that are pointed, trying to make you move one direction or another on issues. They're allowing you to think about these issues for yourself and to come up with your own solutions based on what you've heard in the class, or what you know already, or what you've read elsewhere, what you think about these really, really important questions about the Gospels for each of these lectures. And also I include a bibliography for further reading, and annotated bibliography, where I explain what each of these books is and whether it would be suitable for you. The regular price for this 8-lecture course is $53.95, as you'll see on the site. But we're doing a special launch price for the course. If you buy this course uh, before Friday, September 23rd at midnight, midnight Pacific time. If you buy it before Friday, September 23rd, midnight Pacific time, it will cost only $47.95, so over a 10% savings. So that's the deal. If you're interested in knowing more about the New Testament, especially about the Gospels, for whatever reasons you have, then I hope you can take a look at the website, bartehrman.com/gospels.